Walter had always imagined family reunions as warm, joyful affairs, laughter echoing, old stories retold, and a deep sense of belonging. But as he sat among his children and grandchildren, he felt something unexpected. He was a guest at his own table. The faces around him were familiar but distant, the conversations lively but somehow foreign. He had spent a lifetime believing that family was unbreakable, that love would always bridge the gaps of time. Yet, in that moment, he realized a painful truth. Time doesn't just change people, it separates them. And sometimes, you don't notice until it's too late. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion. His 85th birthday. A grand family reunion. But as he sat there, watching, he felt something else creeping in, a quiet, undeniable sadness. Walter had always imagined that family bonds were unshakable, that no matter how much time passed, his children would always be his children, their laughter familiar, their voices unchanged. But now, he saw them for who they had become, busy adults with lives that no longer revolved around him. They called him Dad with warmth, but also with a distance he hadn't expected. His son, Greg, once the boy who clung to his leg, now spoke to him with the careful patience people use with the elderly. His daughter, Lisa, who used to cry whenever he left for work, now excused herself frequently to check her phone. He realized, too late, that time had not just aged them, it had separated them. A group of grandchildren huddled around a table, laughing over a video on someone's phone. Walter didn't know what they were watching. He didn't know their inside jokes, their favorite songs, their dreams. Had he ever really known them? He had told himself there would be time. Time to teach them how to fish, time to tell them stories of his youth, time to truly connect. But life had kept moving. And now, watching them from a distance, he understood that he was a guest in their world, not a part of it. The evening wore on, and Walter found himself sitting beside his younger sister, June, the only one left from his childhood. She was frail, her once sharp wit dulled by time, but her eyes held the same knowing look they always had. "You ever think about how many reunions we skipped?" she asked suddenly. Walter swallowed. Yeah. They had been busy. Jobs, raising kids, chasing after things that had seemed so important then. They had missed birthdays, anniversaries, Sunday dinners, always assuming there'd be another. Now, the family gatherings were fewer, the faces missing from the table increasing with each year. And suddenly, he wished he had gone to every single one. As the night ended, Walter's great-granddaughter, no older than 5, toddled up to him, a hesitant smile on her face. She held out a piece of cake, messy and uneven, clearly cut by her tiny hands. "For you, Grandpa," she said softly. He took it, his hands trembling slightly, and smiled. Maybe he had missed some things. Maybe time had taken more than he realized. But at that moment, with that small gesture, he also understood something else. Love doesn't disappear. It changes, it shifts, but it never truly leaves. And perhaps, even in old age, that was enough. Walter took a small bite of the cake his great-granddaughter had handed him. It was too sweet, too dense, the way a child's first attempts at baking always were. But he swallowed it down with a smile, nodding his approval as the little girl beamed and ran off. The house buzzed with laughter and conversation. The younger ones were caught up in their own world, the adults preoccupied with responsibilities they couldn't leave at the door. The past and present coexisted in the same space, yet somehow, Walter felt stuck in neither. He was somewhere in between, watching life continue without him. He glanced at the empty chair beside his. Margaret would have been sitting there if life had been kinder. She had loved family gatherings, always reminding the children to cherish these moments because one day, there won't be as many of us left. Walter had never taken those words seriously, until now. His brother, Robert, had been gone for years. His best friend, Charlie, who had once been a permanent fixture at their family dinners, had passed away last winter. And Margaret, her absence was the one he felt the most. He reached for his wedding ring, turning it absent-mindedly on his wrinkled finger. At the other end of the yard, his children talked and laughed, their voices overlapping. They rarely mentioned their mother anymore. Not because they had forgotten, but because grief had a way of fading into the background of everyday life. But for Walter, the silence where she used to be was deafening. The conversations that feel different. "Dad, you need anything?" Greg asked, leaning down slightly so Walter could hear him better over the noise. Walter shook his head. "I'm fine." Greg smiled, but there was something else in his eyes, concern, maybe pity. Walter had seen that look before. It was the look people gave when they started treating you like a fragile antique instead of a person. Not long ago, their conversations had been filled with debates about work, politics, and stories from the past. Now, they revolved around doctor's appointments, medications, and whether he was getting enough help. Walter hated it. He wanted to ask Greg how his job was going, whether he and his wife still took road trips like they used to. He wanted to hear about Lisa's plans for retirement, about the grandkids' hopes and dreams. But every time he tried, the conversation circled back to him, his health, his needs, his limitations. He understood that they cared, that they meant well. But he wished they realized that just because his body was slowing down didn't mean his mind had disappeared. As the night stretched on, Walter found himself drawn to the quiet edges of the party. He walked slowly, steadying himself against the railing of the porch, and took in the sight of his family. He was proud of them. He really was. But regret settled in his chest like a heavy stone. He regretted the years when work had come first, the evenings spent at the office instead of at home. He regretted the times he had been too tired to play, too distracted to listen, too certain that there would always be another chance. He had done his best. He knew that. But looking at his grandchildren, teenagers now, with their own worlds to navigate, he realized how much he had missed. Would they remember him? Really remember him? Not just as the old man sitting in the corner, but as someone who had stories to tell, wisdom to share. Or would he become just a name on a family tree, a collection of black and white photos in a dusty album? Just as he was sinking too far into his thoughts, his granddaughter, Emily, came up beside him. "Hey, Grandpa." She nudged his arm gently. "You okay?" Walter smiled, pushing his thoughts aside, just taking it all in. She leaned on the railing next to him. "I was thinking about that story you told me when I was little. The one about the time you and Uncle Robert got caught sneaking into the baseball stadium." Walter chuckled, surprised she remembered. "Ah, the Great Escape of '54. Emily laughed. "You should tell it again. The little ones haven't heard it." For the first time that night, Walter felt like he belonged again. He wasn't just an old man at a family reunion. He was a storyteller, a keeper of history, a bridge between the past and the future. He gathered the youngest ones around, their eyes wide as he spun the tale with all the mischief and humor he could muster. For a moment, the distance between generations disappeared. For a moment, he was more than his age. And as their laughter echoed into the night, Walter realized something. Maybe time had taken things from him. Maybe the family dynamics had changed in ways he couldn't control. But as long as his stories lived on, as long as they remembered him, he was still here. The stars had begun to scatter across the darkening sky, the once lively family reunion settling into a quieter hum. The children, worn out from play, curled up on their parents' laps or dozed in the corners of the porch. The adults lingered in smaller clusters, their laughter softer now, their conversations turning reflective. Walter remained seated in his wooden chair, rocking slightly, the remnants of his great-granddaughter's cake still on the plate beside him. The earlier melancholy had not disappeared, but something else had settled in, a warmth, faint but steady, like the glow of a distant lantern. After he finished telling the baseball stadium story, the children had begged for more. It had been years since Walter had spoken so much at a gathering like this. "You really ran 3 blocks with a cop chasing you?" one of the grandkids had asked in disbelief. Walter had grinned. "Ran. I flew." Even the adults had leaned in to listen. Lisa had laughed in a way he hadn't heard in years. Greg had shaken his head, muttering, "Dad, you were a menace," but with an unmistakable pride in his voice. For the first time in a long time, Walter hadn't felt invisible. As he sat now, watching the embers of the night burn low, Emily returned and perched on the railing beside him. "I love hearing your stories," she said, wrapping her arms around her knees. "Makes me feel like I know you in a different way." Walter studied her for a moment. He had spent so much time worrying about the gaps, the missed birthdays, the years that had slipped through his fingers, that he had forgotten something important. Memories didn't only live in the moments you missed. They lived in the ones you chose to share. Walter sighed, tilting his head toward Emily. "Tell me something about you." She raised an eyebrow. "About me?" He nodded. "I've been talking all night. But I don't know what you're passionate about these days. What do you love?" Emily hesitated, then smiled. "I started writing." Walter's eyes widened. "Writing? Like stories?" She nodded. "Poetry, mostly. And some short fiction. It helps me make sense of things, I guess." Walter felt a twinge in his chest, not sadness, but something close to it. Why had it taken him this long to ask? How many of his other grandchildren had stories he had never heard? You know, he said slowly, your grandma used to write. She had this little leather notebook she carried everywhere. She wrote down thoughts, little poems. She never let me read them, but I always knew they meant the world to her. Emily's eyes lit up. Really? I never knew that. Walter nodded. Maybe you take after her. Emily seemed to sit a little taller at that, and Walter realized that, in all the years he had spent missing Margaret, he had overlooked the ways she still lingered, in Emily's love for words, in Lisa's stubborn kindness, in the way Greg always made sure everyone was taken care of. As the reunion began winding down, family members started gathering their things, exchanging hugs, and making their way to their cars. Lisa came over, squeezing Walter's shoulder. I'll call you tomorrow, Dad. He nodded. I'd like that. Greg leaned down. Need help getting inside? Walter shook his head. Nah, I think I'll sit here a little longer. One by one, they left, until only a few cars remained in the driveway. The house was quiet again. The laughter, the noise, the chaos, it was all gone. But Walter didn't feel as alone as he had earlier. The family he had built, the lives that had branched from his own, were still moving forward. They might not revolve around him anymore, but they still carried pieces of him. His stories, his lessons, his love. And in the end, wasn't that what truly mattered? Walter took a deep breath, looking up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Walter sat in the stillness of the night, the distant hum of crickets filling the silence left behind by his family's departure. The porch light cast a warm glow over the wooden floorboards, illuminating the few scattered plates and empty chairs that had, just moments ago, been filled with life. He exhaled slowly, sinking deeper into his chair. His body ached, his joints stiff from sitting too long, but he wasn't ready to go inside just yet. A reunion had a way of stirring things up, memories, regrets, emotions he thought had settled long ago. As he looked around, his mind wandered to reunions of the past. The ones in the small house he and Margaret had built, where the kids had once run barefoot through the grass. The ones he had missed because of work, always promising there would be another. He thought of his brother, Robert. They used to be inseparable, until life pulled them in different directions. A fight over something stupid had led to silence, and that silence stretched into years. They had spoken again eventually, but not enough. Never enough. Robert had died 2 summers ago. Walter had meant to visit more often, had meant to call, but time had slipped away, as it always did. He swallowed hard, gripping the armrest of his chair. It wasn't just about Robert. It was about all the things he had let pass by, assuming there would be more time. A soft breeze rustled the trees, and he could almost hear Margaret's voice whispering in his mind. You can't change the past, Walter, but you can still change what's left. Just as he was lost in thought, the screen door creaked open. You're still out here. Walter turned to see Emily, his granddaughter, stepping onto the porch. She had changed into a sweater, her hair now loose around her shoulders. I was about to go to bed, she admitted, but I saw you sitting out here. Walter smiled. Guess I just like the quiet. Emily hesitated before pulling up a chair next to him. She looked down at her hands, as if debating something, before finally speaking. Do you ever regret things, Grandpa? Walter let out a low chuckle. You asking if an 85-year-old man has regrets? He shook his head. I've got more regrets than I can count. Emily nodded, staring out into the night. I feel like I'm always so busy. School, work, life. And I keep telling myself I'll have time for the things that matter later. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. But then I look at you, and I wonder, do we ever really get that time back? Walter felt a lump in his throat. She was asking the very question that had been circling in his own mind all night. No, he said honestly. We don't. Emily exhaled, her shoulders sinking. That's what I was afraid of. But, Walter added, we do get to decide what we do with the time we have left. She looked at him, waiting. I spent too many years thinking there'd always be another chance. Another holiday. Another visit. And the truth is, sometimes there isn't. He tapped his fingers against the armrest. But you've got time right now. And if you already know how precious it is, you're ahead of where I was at your age. Emily gave him a small smile. So what do I do with that? Walter thought for a moment before answering. Make the phone call. Take the trip. Say what you need to say before it's too late. He glanced at her. And keep writing. Your words will last longer than you will. Make sure they matter. Emily blinked, as if committing his words to memory. Then she reached over and placed her hand over his. I'm really glad I stayed out here with you, she whispered. Walter squeezed her hand gently. Me too, sweetheart. After a while, Emily stood, stretching. I should get to bed. But, thanks, Grandpa. Walter nodded, watching as she slipped back inside, the screen door closing softly behind her. He sat there a little longer, staring up at the stars. The regrets would always be there. The years he couldn't get back, the faces he wouldn't see again. But there was still time for moments like this. For as long as he had breath in his lungs, he could still be present. He could still love. He could still matter. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The night stretched on, silent except for the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Walter remained on the porch, rocking slowly in his chair, listening to the echoes of the evening in his mind. The laughter, the familiar voices, the stories he thought had been forgotten but were still carried by his grandchildren. He had spent much of the day mourning what had been lost, time, relationships, opportunities. But now, as the reunion settled into memory, he realized something else. Not everything had slipped away. Some things had stayed. The door creaked open again. Walter half expected Emily to have come back, but instead, it was Greg. His son stepped onto the porch, holding 2 cups of tea. Figured you might still be awake, Greg said, handing one to Walter before sitting down beside him. Walter accepted the cup, the warmth spreading through his hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Greg spoke again. Tonight was nice, he said, his voice quiet. It's been a long time since we all got together like this. Walter nodded. Too long. Greg sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I know we don't visit as much as we should. Life just gets busy. Walter looked at his son, the man who had once been the boy who followed him everywhere, who had looked up at him like he was the strongest person in the world. Now, Greg had his own family, his own responsibilities. Walter understood that. But still, I used to say the same thing, Walter admitted. And then one day, I woke up and realized all the people I meant to visit were gone. Greg exhaled, staring down into his tea. I don't want that to happen with us. Walter turned to him, studying his face. There was something there, something unspoken. This isn't just about me, is it? Walter asked. Greg hesitated, then shook his head. Lisa and I, we've been talking a lot about Mom lately. About how fast time is moving. He let out a soft chuckle. Seems like just yesterday we were kids, and now our own kids are almost grown. Walter saw it now, the weight in Greg's eyes, the same weight he himself had carried for so many years. You're starting to understand, aren't you? Walter said gently. Greg met his gaze, and for the first time in a long time, Walter saw the boy he used to be, the one who had clung to his hand, who had believed his father had all the answers. I think I am, Greg admitted. Walter reached over and patted his son's shoulder. Then don't make the same mistakes I did. Greg nodded, and a comfortable silence settled between them. The kind of silence that only existed between 2 people who understood each other. Eventually, Greg stood, stretching. I should head inside. You coming? Walter hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, in a minute. Greg placed a hand on Walter's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze before heading inside. Walter listened to the door close behind him, leaving him alone with the night once more. He gazed up at the stars, the same ones he and Margaret used to lie under when they were young, dreaming about the life they would build. The life they had built. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always easy. But it had been full. And that, Walter realized, was enough. Slowly, he pushed himself up from the chair, steadying himself as he took one last look at the quiet yard, the place that had, for one night, been filled with his family. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he turned and walked inside. The reunion was over. But the love remained. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered.